The conference room smelled like fresh coffee and old money, and my brother walked in like he owned both. He wasn't alone. His wife, a woman who had mastered the art of looking devastated without feeling anything, sat beside him in a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Their attorney, the kind of man who kept his cufflinks polished and his conscience flexible, slid a thick folder across the mahogany table before he'd even fully settled into his chair. "We are requesting an immediate freeze on all liquid assets," the attorney said. "Our position is that the decedent lacked testamentary capacity at the time the will was amended 14 months ago. Our client was the intended primary beneficiary for decades. The current document does not reflect our grandmother's true wishes. It reflects the wishes of the woman who controlled her access to the outside world." The estate attorney looked at me across the table. "Miss Harlow, do you have a response?" I didn't stand up. I didn't reach for my folder. I just looked at my phone screen and set it face down on the table. "Not yet," I said. "We're still waiting for someone." My brother's jaw tightened. He had always hated waiting. Waiting implied that someone else's time mattered as much as his. His wife leaned over and whispered something in his ear. He nodded slowly, then looked at me with the particular expression he reserved for moments when he was certain he had already won. It was the same expression he'd worn at every Thanksgiving table, every Christmas dinner, every phone call where he'd reminded me, gently but clearly, that I was the difficult one. The one who made everything complicated. The one who could never just let things go. I held his gaze and said nothing. The door opened. She was not what anyone in that room expected. She was a small woman, perhaps 60, wearing reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead and carrying a canvas tote bag with a library logo on the side. She had the unhurried walk of someone who had seen too many conference rooms to be impressed by this one. She set her bag down at the end of the table, pulled out a legal pad, and looked at the estate attorney. "Apologies for the delay. Traffic on the 94 was brutal." She looked around the table. "I'm the trust officer from Meridian Private Bank. We are the successor trustee for the Eleanor Harlow Revocable Trust, now irrevocable upon the grantor's passing." She opened her bag and produced a sealed document envelope, setting it on the table with the casual precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "I believe we have some things to discuss." The room shifted. My brother's attorney sat up straighter. "We weren't informed that a corporate trustee had been named." "You weren't the client," the trust officer said pleasantly. "Your client's grandmother was." I watched my brother's face in the moment he understood that this meeting was not going to go the way he had planned. His wife grabbed his hand under the table. I saw it happen. I saw the exact second the confidence drained out of him and something colder moved in to replace it. I had been waiting 3 years for that second, and the whole time I was sitting there watching it arrive, I was somewhere else entirely. I was 24 years old, standing in a hospital corridor that smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, holding a paper cup of cold vending machine coffee, listening to my brother tell me that what had happened was my fault. Grandma had fallen in the kitchen, a hairline fracture in her hip. Nothing catastrophic, the doctor said, but at 81, nothing about a fall was truly nothing. She would need physical therapy. She would need someone with her at night. She would need more than she had been needing, and the question of who would provide that had arrived in our family with the subtlety of a wrecking ball. My brother had driven down from Chicago with his wife. They had been at the hospital for approximately 2 hours before he pulled me into the corridor and told me that this was a direct consequence of my negligence. "You were supposed to be checking on her," he said. "You live 20 minutes away. 20 minutes, Nora. And she's lying in there with a broken hip because you couldn't be bothered." I had been checking on her. I had been there 3 times that week. The fall happened on a Tuesday afternoon, a time I was at work, a time I had specifically called to check in, and Grandma had told me she was fine, she was just going to make herself some soup. She didn't need me to come. I told my brother all of this. He looked at me the way he always looked at me when I offered an explanation he didn't want to hear. "She is 81 years old," he said. "You don't take her word for it. You go anyway." His wife nodded from behind him, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a woman who had rehearsed this moment on the drive down. "We're going to need to talk about a care arrangement," my brother continued. "A real one. Not whatever this has been." What it had been, up to that point, was me. Every week, without being asked, without being thanked, without being compensated, I drove her to her cardiology appointments and her eye exams and her bi-monthly visits to the salon where she'd been getting her hair set for 40 years. I sorted her medications into the little weekly organizer she kept on the bathroom counter. I fixed the things that broke. I sat with her on Sunday afternoons and let her show me old photographs and tell me stories I had already heard a dozen times, because she loved telling them and I loved watching her face when she did. My brother had visited twice in the previous year. Both times with his wife. Both times for holiday weekends. Both times leaving by Sunday afternoon to beat the traffic. But I was the negligent one. I didn't argue with him in that corridor. I was too tired and too scared and too thoroughly trained to absorb blame without fighting back. That was the dynamic we had grown up in. My brother was the golden one, the firstborn, The one who had gone to a good school, married well, built something that looked impressive from the outside. I was the one who had stayed. The one who hadn't quite launched. The one who was always, in some quiet and unspoken way, a disappointment. When Grandma came home from the hospital 6 weeks later, I was the one who set up the hospital bed in the downstairs guest room. I was the one who learned how to do the physical therapy exercises, so I could help her practice between sessions. My brother sent a fruit basket and a card signed by both of them. Over the next 3 years, the visits tapered off even further. His wife stopped coming entirely. He showed up at Easter one year, stayed 4 hours, and left before dinner because she had a headache from the drive. I stopped expecting anything from them. I stopped calling to remind him of her birthday. Stopped texting him when she had a bad week. Stopped trying to make him participate in something he had already quietly decided wasn't his responsibility. What I didn't stop doing was being there. When her memory started to slip, I was there. When she got confused about her medications and took the wrong dose and I had to call poison control at 2 in the morning, I was there. When she sat in the living room at 3 a.m. because she couldn't remember where she was, I sat with her until she did. I had a key to her house. I had her pharmacy on speed dial. I had her cardiologist's cell phone number because he had given it to me personally after the 3rd emergency visit and said, "Call me directly. Don't let it get that far again." 14 months before she died, on a clear October morning, I drove her to Meridian Private Bank. She had asked me to. She had told me, in the precise and deliberate way she spoke when she wanted to make sure I understood something, that she had some paperwork to take care of and she needed me there. I sat in the lobby and read a magazine while she was in the office. I didn't go in with her. I didn't ask what was in the documents. I had driven her there because she asked me to, the same way I drove her everywhere because that was what I did. When she came back out, she was carrying a small envelope. She handed it to me and said, "Put this somewhere safe. Don't open it unless something happens." I put it in the fireproof lockbox in my apartment closet, the same place I kept my passport and my own will and the folder of her important documents I had been maintaining for 2 years. I forgot about it, mostly. There were other things to manage. She died on a February morning, quietly, in her own bed, with me holding one hand and a photograph of my grandfather in her other. It was the death she had wanted. She had told me so. My brother arrived 4 hours later. The grief on his face looked real. I believed it was real. People can genuinely mourn someone they failed while they were alive. The two things are not mutually exclusive. What happened in the days after the funeral was when I understood what kind of grief it actually was. He found out about the will amendment from the estate attorney, who had been instructed to notify all named parties after the death. He called me the same night. His voice was tight and controlled in the way it got when he was furious but had decided to perform calmness. "I need you to explain to me what you did," he said. I told him I didn't know what he was referring to. "The will, Nora. She changed the will. 14 months ago. You were there. You drove her to the bank. I need you to tell me what you said to her." I told him I hadn't been in the meeting. I had sat in the lobby. The silence on the other end of the line was long enough that I pulled the phone away from my ear to check if the call had dropped. "She was not in a state to be making decisions like that," he said finally. "You know that. I know that. And I promise you, I am going to make sure the right people know that too." He hung up. 2 months later, his attorney slid that folder across the mahogany table. I had been waiting. The trust officer opened the sealed envelope and laid the documents in front of her in a precise row, the way you lay out cards when you are about to show a winning hand and you want the other players to understand what they're looking at before you say a word. "The Eleanor Harlow Trust was formally amended 14 months ago," she said. "It is structured as an irrevocable trust upon the grantor's death. The assets include the primary residence, 2 investment accounts, and liquid holdings totaling approximately $2.3 million. She looked at my brother's attorney. "I assume you've had the opportunity to review the trust instrument." "We have reviewed what was provided to us," the attorney said carefully. "Then you've seen Article 11. The trust officer slid a clean copy across the table. "The in terrorem clause. Any beneficiary who initiates legal proceedings to challenge the validity of this trust, or who contests the competency of the grantor at the time of execution, forfeits their entire interest in the trust estate. Automatically. The clause is self-executing upon filing." My brother's wife made a sound that was not quite a word. The attorney looked at the clause. He looked at it for a long time. "We filed a formal challenge 2 weeks ago," he said. His voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of a man presenting a case. It was the voice of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like. "You did," the trust officer confirmed. "It was entered into the record on the 14th. The clause was triggered at that moment." My brother turned to me. His face was doing something complicated that I had never seen it do before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the entitled certainty I had grown up watching. It was something closer to vertigo. "You knew," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was almost a question. "I told you not to file," I said. "I sent you 3 emails. I left 2 voicemails. I told you to wait and let the process work. He had not waited. His attorney was already leaning over to him, voice low, hand gesturing. My brother stared at the document in front of him. His wife had gone very still in the way people go still when they are calculating losses. We wish to withdraw the challenge, the attorney said. The challenge has been filed and entered into the record, the estate attorney said. It cannot be retroactively unfiled. The clause has been triggered. We were acting on incomplete information. We weren't aware. With respect, the trust instrument was provided to you in full prior to filing. The clause is not buried. It is Article 11. It is the 3rd page. My brother's wife stood up. She placed both hands flat on the table, and I recognized the posture. I had seen it before, in smaller rooms at smaller tables, every time she decided that charm had failed and force was the next available option. This is not what Eleanor would have wanted, she said. She loved her grandson. She would never have deliberately cut him out. Whatever influence was exerted on her in that meeting. I wasn't in the meeting, I said. You drove her there. I drive her everywhere. I drove her to her cardiologist. I drove her to get her hair done. I drove her to the bank because she asked me to. I sat in the lobby and read a magazine. That's very convenient. I have a photo, I said. Time-stamped. I was in the waiting area. Lobby security cameras will show the same thing if anyone wants to request the footage. The trust officer produced a small stack of papers from her canvas tote. The bank does maintain security records. But before we get to that, I want to address the competency allegation, because this is the part that I think you'll find most significant. She laid a bound document on the table. 10 days before the trust amendment was signed, Mrs. Harlow scheduled 2 appointments through our recommended referral network. A geriatric psychiatrist and a neuropsychological evaluator. Both conducted independent assessments. Both found her to have full testamentary capacity. Both completed signed affidavits. She paused. Both sessions were video recorded at her request. The files are held in escrow with the bank and have already been submitted to the court as part of the trust record. The attorney looked at the document. He looked at it the way my brother had looked at me in that hospital corridor, like he was waiting for it to change into something more manageable. She arranged those evaluations herself? The estate attorney asked. She did. She called our office and requested them. She paid for them from her own account. The memo line on both checks reads, Clarity exam, self-requested. The trust officer looked at my brother. She knew this day was coming. She wanted the record to be unambiguous. My brother's wife sat back down. Something about watching that happen, watching her lower herself into that chair like the air had been let out of her, pulled me back again, not to a hospital corridor this time. Earlier than that, I was 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in my grandmother's house on a Saturday afternoon, doing homework while she stood at the stove making something that smelled like butter and brown sugar. She used to hum when she cooked. Old songs, half-remembered, the kind where she knew the melody but had forgotten the words, so she just held the notes. My brother had been there that weekend too. He was 17, home from his first year of a prep school our parents had taken out a second mortgage to afford. He had been in a good mood the whole visit, charming and easy the way he could be when he wanted something. And he had wanted something. A car for the summer. He'd spent the whole weekend laying groundwork, being helpful, being funny, being the version of himself that was designed to make adults want to give him things. On the last afternoon, when Grandma was washing up and I was still at the table with my homework, I heard him in the living room. His voice was low and warm and entirely manufactured. She doesn't need to know, I heard him say. It's between us. It would really help me out, Grandma. I just need a little boost. She had given it to him. $2,000, tucked into an envelope. I saw her do it. I didn't say anything because I was 12, and he was 17 and the family hierarchy was not a thing I had the standing to challenge. He bought the car. He never paid her back. I know because I helped her with her finances in the last 4 years of her life, and I went through her records and there was no repayment. There was another loan 3 years after that and another one 2 years after that. And by the time she died there was a quiet ledger of generosity that had never been returned. Not in money and not in time and not in any of the small accumulated ways that people pay each other back when they actually show up. I had never said any of this out loud. Not to him, not to anyone. It was not my business to say. It was her money and her choice, and she loved him and she was allowed to love him even when he didn't deserve it. But she had also known. She had known exactly what she was doing when she scheduled those evaluations. She had known exactly what she was doing when she handed me that envelope and told me to put it somewhere safe. She had been preparing this for a long time. The competency challenge is the entirety of your legal basis, the estate attorney said to my brother's attorney. The trust was properly executed. The trustee is present and the assets are secured. If the competency claim is withdrawn, there is no remaining ground for the challenge. We're not withdrawing the competency claim, the attorney said, but his voice didn't have the same architecture it had possessed 40 minutes ago. It was a building with the support beams removed, still standing, but only out of habit. Then I'd like to note for the record, the trust officer said, that the video recordings are quite detailed. In one of them, Mrs. Harlow explicitly describes her reasons for the trust amendment in her own words. She names your client by name. She describes specific incidents. The trust officer looked at my brother calmly. I don't think you want those recordings entered as exhibits in a court proceeding. But that is, of course, your choice. The attorney put his pen down on the table. My brother looked at me. I had prepared for this moment. I had rehearsed what I might feel: satisfaction, vindication, something clean and resolved. What I actually felt was older and quieter than any of those things. It was the feeling of standing at the end of a very long road and understanding that you had been walking it alone the whole time, and that the destination was not a reward but simply a place where the road stopped. If you proceed with the competency challenge, I said, those recordings become part of the public court record. Everything she said about why she made the changes she made will be entered into evidence. I don't think you want that. My brother's wife looked at him. She was specific, he asked. His voice had dropped to something almost private. She was very specific, the trust officer said. The silence in the room was different from the silence at the beginning of the meeting. The first silence had been strategic, the quiet of people positioning themselves. This one was the silence of a card game where all the hands were face up on the table and everyone could see exactly who had been bluffing. My brother stood up. He didn't say anything to me. He didn't look at me. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and walked to the door, and his wife followed him, and their attorney followed them, and the door closed. I sat at the table for a long moment. The trust officer was repacking her canvas tote with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been in this room in 100 different cities. She glanced at me. She chose well, she said. Not a compliment. Just a statement of fact. I nodded. I drove home on the freeway and thought about nothing for 20 minutes, which was something I had not been able to do in a very long time. My phone buzzed 3 times in the cup holder. I didn't look at it until I was parked in my building's garage, engine off, sitting in the quiet. 2 texts from my brother. 1 from his wife. I read them all. They were variations on the same theme: that this wasn't over, that I had manipulated an old woman, that the family would not forget this, that I would regret it. The wife's message was the most baroque. It used the phrase morally bankrupt twice in 4 sentences, which I thought was interesting given the context. I put the phone in my bag and went upstairs. 3 weeks later, the estate closed. The transfer was clean and final. The house went to me, along with the investment accounts and the liquid holdings and the small battered copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God that had lived on Grandma's nightstand for as long as I could remember and had my name written inside the front cover in her handwriting, from a birthday 9 years ago. 2 weeks after that, my brother's attorney sent a letter withdrawing all challenges with prejudice. The letter was 2 paragraphs and contained no apology. I didn't need one. What I learned, sitting in my apartment the night the final paperwork was signed, was something she had been trying to teach me for years. She used to say it in different ways, in different moods, sometimes as advice and sometimes as consolation, and sometimes just as the kind of observation that older people make when they have been watching the world long enough to notice its patterns. She would say, the people who take the most have the least capacity to understand what that costs. And you can spend your whole life trying to make them understand it, or you can spend your whole life building something they can't take. She had built something they couldn't take, and she had spent 14 months making sure I knew how to hold it. I called the trust officer the next morning to confirm the final transfer details, and she told me everything had cleared, and I thanked her, and she said, in that same matter-of-fact way, she said everything. She came in with very clear instructions. She knew exactly what she wanted and she knew exactly why. In 30 years of doing this work, I don't see that kind of clarity very often. I told her I believed it. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table, not Grandma's table, my own table, and I opened the envelope she had given me 14 months ago. The one I had never opened because nothing had happened until now and I had followed her instructions and waited. Inside was a single piece of paper, handwritten. Her handwriting was still elegant even at the end, even when her hands shook. She had steady hands when it mattered. It said, I know you will do the right thing with all of it. I know because you have always done the right thing, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. The people who love you for what you can give them are not the people who love you. I'm sorry it took me too long to draw that line clearly. You deserved it drawn much sooner. Below that, in smaller letters, the soup recipe is in the blue binder, second shelf. You always forgot to add enough salt. Add more than you think you need. I sat there for a while. Then I got up and looked in the blue binder, because I had in fact always forgotten the salt. My brother called once more, about a month later. Not to argue. Not with an attorney. Just him. His actual voice, without the architecture of a prepared position. He said he was calling to say that he hoped I was doing okay. I said I was. He said he hoped I knew that he had loved her too. I said I knew that. I said that loving someone and showing up for them are 2 different things, and that one of them matters and one of them doesn't, and that I hoped someday he understood the difference. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're probably right." He didn't apologize. I hadn't expected him to. Apologies require a specific kind of self-awareness that takes most people longer to develop than a single phone call. But he had said I was probably right, and from him, in that particular moment, that was a full sentence. I thanked him for calling. I hung up. I did not block his number. I did not delete it. But I set my phone face down on the table and went back to what I had been doing, which was sitting in the afternoon light in my apartment with the blue binder open, making a shopping list. I was adding more salt than I thought I needed. That was enough for now,